William Blake was really thought to be kind of a crackpot in his day because he applied some Gnostic concepts, that is, a duality of gods, and created paintings like this with a very garish use, rather a modern use of color here, illustrating some of the poetry and some of the ideas he had. This is intended to be God measuring some part of the earth here in the process of creation, Ancient of Days being a synonym for God. What do you make of this? It wasn't very well accepted at the time. Only a few people actually supported what Blake was doing, and he was typical of the artist who really felt his convictions very strongly, and although he lived in poverty, he created things as he wished to create them. This is the kind of painting you might see as a subject matter of a poster in a modern-day head shop, not something created in a time when George Washington was still alive. It really wasn't well accepted in his day, and it took quite a bit after his lifetime for this type of art to be appreciated as a legitimate expression of artistic endeavor. Now, visual poetry or visual truth. Here we have Joseph Turner, who very much tried to compete and outdo Claude Lorraine in picturing classical landscapes in a very dramatic way, with this emphasis and perhaps even overemphasis on brilliant light and its effect on things in the background. Other things that Turner did, though, such as this example, really do look forward to the future. This is an impression of a steamer in a snowstorm, as if this object here in the middle, in the center part of this picture, is actually a side wheel steamer floundering in very rough water, as observed perhaps from some boat that's nearby. So you can just make out here in the bottom part of this, these are very violent waves, and here's water splashing all around, and you see this plume here of brown smoke coming up from the ship. But everything else is as if you're looking through some sort of a glass that's very obscured, although perhaps it's just all the spray being thrown up. This really was too far out for people of the time to appreciate. It really, although it predates the Impressionist era, really kind of predicts what's to come with this impression of the scene. Rather than the artist painting what he knows is there, he's painting what he sees with his eyes. So let's compare these two. This work of Turner is imaginative. He's painting what he thinks is there in terms of a Greek temple in this scene. Here, he's probably still using his imagination, but we could easily picture that perhaps he is on this other boat, observing this steamer floundering in the water, and this is actually what his eye records. He doesn't make the detail of the steamer any greater. He knows what a steamer looks like. He could easily paint that detail in, but that's not what his eyes see. So we would call this visual truth. Here's, in contrast to Turner, we have John Constable, who actually didn't have such a high regard for the traditional concepts and departed from those concepts just in the interest of painting what he saw. Now, there's a lot about this particular painting that is very unusual for the period. First of all, the composition, a large tree, only part of it being seen, and kind of not a very pleasant looking one either. It looks like it's sort of eaten away and rotten at the bottom. The picture almost entirely in browns, and apparently he's up someplace and observing a person on a path far below him. Very unusual composition here, challenging the prevailing sentiment about how a painting should be composed. And the coloring and the brushwork also not what tradition would dictate, but Constable felt that he had to express what he was seeing, and he had to express it in a way that made sense to him. Here's something that looks a bit more traditional, about the same era by John Constable, but not well received at the time. First of all, it seems rather sentimental. It's just a farm scene. Here's sort of a shallow creek, and here's a hay wagon trying to cross it. And off in the background, we see this very interesting meadow lit in a splotchy sort of a way by the sun coming through these clouds in a rather dramatic sky. Well, what is there significant about this? Well, not much. It's not the kind of a scene that portrayed anything of Greek or Roman mythology. It didn't have any profound expression of truth or moralistic intentions here. It didn't have anything to do with religion. It was a landscape, and landscapes were not particularly well respected as art. What Constable was trying to do was not accomplish any of those things, it seems. He was simply trying to paint what his eyes saw, and the more we look at it, the more we might be drawn into this scene and actually appreciate it for what it is. It's a very interesting rendition of a scene of ordinary country life. Not, however, intended to make fun, as some of the peasant paintings of Bruegel in an earlier era, but just simply to portray this rather serene and pleasant countryside scene. These days we might be appreciative of seeing this because it's one of our only records of what the world looked like at that time before the Industrial Revolution changed a lot of the landscape. So here we're on the verge of a change in art, which in chapter 25 will be talked about as a permanent change. In this same era, I've given you some readings about the Romantic era and Romanticism. It has nothing really to do with hugs and kisses and a lot of romance novel kind of stuff. It really talks about a time when people were perhaps disenchanted with what seemed like the triumph of reason in the Age of Enlightenment, that we had no need for things that came before, that science would solve everything. So in many of these romantic paintings, there's an idea of evoking emotion, there's an idea of evoking sort of a melancholy, there's an idea of going back to an earlier age, maybe an age of faith where we didn't expect that everything we learned challenged what we had known earlier. And this is just an example of that. Friedrich is one of the artists of the Romantic era, and perhaps you'll learn a little bit more about Romanticism in the readings I've assigned and one of the videos that accompanies this chapter. And finally, the Academy and exhibitions. It's important to understand what was going on in terms of art around 1700 and 1800. There was an emphasis at that time in the circles in which aristocrats moved and bought art that the old established masters were far to be preferred over anything in the way of a contemporary artist, the work of a contemporary artist. The Academy was the officially sponsored organization in France that trained artists and exhibited their works. And the annual exhibition of the Academy was where those works that were judged by the Academy to be truly significant artworks were displayed. Artworks that were submitted for consideration for exhibition but were rejected were stamped with a red R on the back, and it meant that the artist would have a very tough time finding a buyer for that art. It was almost like the stamp of rejection. The opposite of it was the stamp of approval, having been accepted for the Academy. Some artists really hated this system. They felt that it wasn't right that the Academy and its conservative ways should be the arbiter of people's taste in art, to say what should be or shouldn't be represented in art. This all comes to a head in the middle of the 1800s, when the Academy is challenged in a very significant way. And we're going to see that in chapter 25.